Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Don't forget to go and spoil yourself. You deserve to. Go and get yourself an effervescent sparkling drink or something hot and soothing to drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the first time I ever saw a dead body was when I was a young boy of 10 years old. My grandfather had died serendipitously of a sudden heart attack when he was out driving his tractor across the field. I remember I was playing near the cornfields myself with my older brother. We saw my grandfather infeliciously slumped over the front of the tractor, which was still moving ominously forwards, until it finally slammed and crashed into a tree with a mighty, graceless wallop, and it suddenly stopped. My grandfather remained slouched over the truck. Something didn't look right or feel right about the whole bodeful, ill-fated scene that we were observing. I turned around to my brother Luke and said, "What's wrong with Gramps?" We weren't sure, but I remember in that moment we both knew that something was terribly wrong. My Gramps would not let his tractor go thundering into a tree for no reason at all. Something bad must have happened. So we went tearing on our tiny little legs towards the tractor as fast as we possibly could, only to discover my Gramps was not moving. He was as white as a sheet. All the colour had drained away from his face. His mouth was open, and his eyes seemed glazed over like a dead fish. I was horrified. I began to panic. My heart thundered violently in my chest. My hands trembled. We had no time to lose. Time was of the essence. I knew this. I slid my grandfather quickly onto the ground with my brother's help. At school I'd learnt about CPR. I rather fancied myself as a dab hand when I was working on the plastic dummies on the training course, although the EMT did mention I was a tad too aggressive on the ribs and should possibly tone it down a bit, but otherwise he perceived no one under my watch could possibly die. I had taken him at his word, although he said this with a mischievous twinkle in his eye and a quiver to the lips that faintly suggested the glimmer of a smile. Moments later I was doing urgent chest compressions on my Gramps, believing that if I pummelled his chest hard enough and breathed into his mouth that I would bring him back from the dead. "Gramps!" I say, banging his chest so hard. "Gramps! Gramps! Wake up, Gramps! Wake up!" My brother is watching me, his eyes earnestly hovering over our Gramps, with an expression so pretentiously grave, as if he's resigned to the fact that Gramps is not going to come back from the precipice of death. He's long gone. But I was not about to give up, not yet. I succeeded in breaking most of my grandfather's ribs, in my rambunctious but futile efforts to revive him. Let's just say the coroner, who examined his corpse during the autopsy, told my grandmother that she'd never seen such a vigorous attempt at CPR before. I'm not sure whether that was a compliment or not. We were to learn that he must have died instantly. So fast, in fact, he wouldn't have experienced any pain, which brought us a brief measure of comfort, but not much. My Gramps was finally gone. He was never coming back. I loved my Gramps. He was the only father I'd ever known. Without a doubt, a bright shining light had gone off in our lives. My brother and I stare at each other, tears pouring down our faces. I could taste the salt on my tongue and feel my guts squirming, becoming strangled by my own discomposure. We knew it was too late. Gramps was dead. We ran back to the farmhouse to offload the dreadful news to my grandmother, a heavy burden we would rather not have been carrying. In truth, it has got to be one of the cruelest blows you can get in life, to hear distressing news like that. But there is no way we could bandage up pain like this. My grandmother was in the kitchen. She was icing a large carrot cake with vanilla cream cheese frosting and beaming brightly at us. "Typical! It's so like you. Whenever something's ready to eat, you kids suddenly show up as if by magic. Your timing is impeccable. I found I couldn't say anything to my grandmother. Well, not at that moment, nor could my brother. It was like we were completely lost for words. My throat became dry and scratchy. Nothing came out. Now go and call your Gramps, will you, from the field? Tell him it's tea time, will you? She said, giving me a gentle squeeze. Finally I managed to say, Gramps isn't coming back, Granny. He's dead. The carrot cake my grandmother was holding on the plate in her hand slipped from her grasp, smashing to the side of the range oven and plopping onto the ground, bespeckling the floor in a grimy ocean of cream cheese frosting and sponge that was begging to be hoovered up by her 2 black Labradors, Bella and Baxter, who thought they'd died and gone to heaven, as they began to gobble up all the cake. Without my grandmother protesting, which would normally be the case, my grandmother began screaming. She bolted towards the fields, with flour from her apron flying up in the air, with us following behind her, and the black Labradors, after they'd finished the cake, began racing behind us, with tails thumping ebulliently, as they could smell action in the air, and were exceedingly excited about spontaneous changes in routine. My grandmother fell flat on her knees, beside my grandfather's limp body. She began sobbing so loudly, rocking my Gramps in her arms backwards and forwards. Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! I thought we agreed I was to go first, you silly, silly man. The dogs were pawing my Gramps, whining and licking his face, although they avoided his long wispy white beard. Then 2 of our black labs began to bark at a tree, and I swear I could see a black human-like face, 8 feet off the ground, staring at us through sparkling, deep-set brown eyes. It had a pyramid-shaped head, and it was looking at us for quite some while. The first thought that comes into my head is, oh my God, it's a Bigfoot. Our dogs are barking excitedly at this thing, whatever it is, and then it's gone, just like that. It was easy to think I imagined it, but the dogs had clearly seen something, for they are not inclined to just bark at nothing for no reason. But whatever it was that had been there moments before had all but vanished. Normally such a brief encounter of an anomalous creature spoken about by so many would have stirred up an excited frenzy within me. My brother, whom I realized had not seen what I had seen, but the unheralded dreadful events that day suppressed the strange encounter from my thoughts, for it had been so vague, so obscure, so fleeting, so swift, like a chance dandelion seed blowing up in the wind that could so easily escape your thoughts, and even your immediate attention. I remember the day after my Gramps had died. The very next morning my grandmother found a huge dead turkey on our doorstep, and a basket filled with wild berries. Never in a month of Sundays did I believe such gifts might have come from a Bigfoot offering up his condolences to us. But now I'm absolutely certain that this is indeed the case, as no one ever owned up to dropping us off such a thoughtful gift, and the basket that contained the berries was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't weaved like a normal basket, but looked handmade, green, very fresh. My Gran was exceedingly delighted with the unexpected, generous gift that she believed must have come from one of my grandfather's hunting companions. But when she discovered that the turkey's neck had been strangled, she knew that this was incredibly strange. I mean, who can kill a turkey like that? A wild one, I mean. My Gramps would struggle to take down a wild turkey, usually a tom, sometimes a gobbler, at the very best of times. In truth, these wild turkeys are traditionally very savvy. Let's just say one slight unnatural swagger of a tree branch, a rustle, an unfortunate crack of twigs underneath feet, a brief whisper of a human smell, and those birds would be out of your way so fast they could move with lightning speed if the need arose. Ostensibly, the only way you could take them down is with a bullet from a 12-gauge shotgun or a 22 Magnum rifle. By all accounts, strangling a turkey never happened unless the bird was badly injured and couldn't get away easily. But there was no sign of a bullet hole in the turkey anywhere, or other injuries to speak of. Suffice to say, there were many times my Gramps had returned empty-handed from a turkey hunt, without a trophy to boast about. But then again, for my grandfather, a hunt was never just about attaining a prize. It was about the companionship with a fellow hunter, being close to nature, breathing in the fresh air, enjoying the prepossessing, arresting views of the Colorado mountains that favoured the skyline so generously, with their sculptural intrigue. And then, of course, my Gramps always enjoyed the sunshine beating down warmly on his face. He loved it all. My grandmother was always making the most delicious turkey dishes you've ever tasted, and never once could you accuse her turkey of being dry. She swore it was the technique, how you cooked the meat, that made the difference. She used a combination of roasting, steaming, basting, tinfoil and bacon to achieve this moist, perfect result, and it worked every time. Believe me, wild turkeys taste amazing. It could be that the meat contains high amounts of tryptophan, which increases the happy chemical serotonin in the brain. My grandmother's house was filled with bouquets of flowers from well-wishers and people paying their commiserations over my grandfather's fortuitous death. Indeed, there were so many flowers on every table, mantel, sideboard and windowsill in my grandmother's farmhouse, so it looked exactly like a florist. It was terribly pretty. The irony of ironies is that my grandfather had been to the doctor only a week before he died for his checkup. By all accounts, he didn't have high blood pressure, cholesterol, nor was he overweight. The doctor teased him and said, "Bert Reynolds, I can safely say you're going to live for another 100 years. There's nothing wrong with your health. You're slim, you're fit, you're healthy, in excellent nick." My grandfather had chuckled and said, "Doc, you might be right about many things. I'll give you that. But you're wrong about this. I'm not sure I'm destined for an excessively long life." I don't know how premonitions or stuff like that work, but I will say this. Before my grandfather died, he claimed to have had a repetitive dream of his late mother, standing in a white dress, smiling happily, holding her arms out to him. It was so real, so lucid, that it gave my Gramps chills, but not in a negative way. He had told my grandmother that his mother looked beautiful, younger, radiant, far more so than he ever remembered. She was beckoning for him to follow her. My grandmother was very superstitious, and when she heard about my grandfather's dream, she didn't have a good feeling about it, and immediately organised a doctor's appointment for him to have his annual checkup. But it would seem the doctor found him in perfect health. It left me to conclude that maybe when it's our time to go, it really is our time, and there's not much we can do about it. On the day of the funeral, me and my brother were wearing our Sunday best. My two little cousins, 4-year-old Jeanette and 5-year-old Emma, were wearing pretty wispy ivory dresses and carrying dolls in their hands. They looked like perfect little angels, but angels they certainly were not. My two little nieces, very close in age, were always getting into scraps, most usually about their little dollies. I don't think they had any clue what was really going on at the funeral. They'd been told that Gramps had gone to heaven and wouldn't be coming back. It appeared they were playing dollies in the middle of the church, and the steamy atmosphere between the two of them suggested another little tantrum was beginning to brew. "My dolly is prettier than yours. You're mean. My dolly is much prettier than your dolly is. Tell her, Mummy. Tell her that my dolly is prettier than hers." "Your dollies are both pretty, sweethearts. Now sit down, will you, in the pew and behave yourselves. Everybody's looking at you." Try as she might, my mother's sister, my aunt, kept telling them to keep the noise down. She was getting funny looks from the people in the pew behind, who clearly thought my aunt was not disciplining her children enough. But those two little rascals were very difficult to manage at the very best of times, and believe me, I know. There must have been about 100 people in attendance in the church that day, and this was a tiny, tiny church, so the pews were chock-a-block full. People were forced to stand in the corners. It was so cramped. It was packed to the nines. We were all shoved into the place tightly, like sardines in a tin. My mother and grandmother were wearing black dresses and hats. My grandmother looked like the quintessential grieving widow that you see in the movies. I remember they were both dabbing their tears in the front of the church, while the organ music was being played in the background. The church looked wonderful, with huge arrangements displayed in every corner, in pretty bright colours. Another request of my grandfather's. "Mind that there are no white lilies at my funeral when I die," he had instructed my grandmother. "When I kick the bucket, I want colour, and lots of it. I want you to dress me up in a loud tie, with very bright socks on my feet." My grandmother asked why he wanted to look so bright in his coffin when no one would see him, as to which he said he wanted to make a grand entrance in heaven and stick out from the crowd like a sore thumb, so he didn't get overlooked by the angels at the pearly gates. My grandfather had a great sense of humour and always saw the funny side in everything. My grandmother had told him that they had agreed that she was going first. "I don't know where you got that idea from. That's not going to happen, sweetheart. I'm the one that's going first. The choice is not yours to make." "I wish Bert could see this church now," my grandmother whispered to my mother and her sister. "I mean, he'd have been so delighted to see so many people turn up for his goodbye party, and how loved and appreciated he was in life. He made such an impact on people's lives." My grandmother never used to use the word funeral. If someone was deceased, they were having a goodbye party, and that was that. So as a young boy, I found that analogy quite confusing, as a goodbye party were for people who left the country, not the planet. "I'm not surprised," whispered my mother, who was sitting next to my grandmother in the pew, and giving her an encouraging squeeze. "Dad was so popular with everyone, wasn't he? He made everybody laugh. He was a natural comedian." My grandmother nods approvingly through her misty eyes. "He was that," she agreed. "The life and soul of the party he was." Needless to say, my grandmother had been studiously instructed by my grandfather that when he died, they couldn't play any miserable music in the church. It had to be happy and positive, and they were to have a big party afterwards to celebrate with balloons and party food. And no one was allowed to cry. And my grandmother was to wear cheerful, positive, bright colours. My grandmother accommodated my grandfather's wishes to a degree, but she believed wearing bright colours to a funeral was very unbecoming, very inappropriate, and was something she refused to do, even if it went against my grandfather's wishes. "I'm sorry, but I simply refuse to turn up to church, dressed up to the nines, looking like a bright peacock. What on earth would people think? That I'm celebrating my husband's demise, for goodness sake? Singing for joy because he's gone? No way, I'm not going to do that." As we're sitting patiently on our seats, waiting for the funeral procession, the priest and the hall-bearers to come down the aisle, carrying the coffin, my two little nieces have decided to have a fight over their dolls at this perfectly inopportune moment. My aunt is trying to calm them down. "Shh! Be quiet, girls! Be quiet! Mummy, Beryl's taken my doll. She says she's going to hurt it because I've been horrible to her, but she's the one that started it. She's been horrible to me." At that precise moment, the priest, followed by the coffin with the hall-bearers, comes ambling down the long ribbon of carpet in the centre of the church, and a doll goes flying into the air, while one of my very distressed nieces goes running after it to retrieve it, her eyes blinded by tears. "Mummy, she pulled my dolly's hair really hard. She pulled it hard." My nieces are blindly oblivious of the funeral progressing around them. They're so caught up in their own world. And my niece dashes into a hall-bearer. He crashes back into the men behind him, so they all lose their footing, and one side of the coffin has no support, so the coffin flips over on its side. The flowers on the coffin go flying up in the air, scattering everywhere, like a confetti bomb, with my grandfather's corpse discharging from the coffin, and all you can see is his red socks as two shoes fall off his feet and go flying up in the church. People scream as my grandfather's deceased corpse flops onto the floor. People stare on in abject horror, as if they can't quite fathom what has just actually happened. Some people are so bemused that it's like they open and close their mouths like stunned goldfish, but nothing comes out. It's like something you'd expect to happen in a movie, but not in real life. The hall-bearers compose themselves and very quickly replace my grandfather into the coffin, and the funeral service goes on as before, as if nothing had happened. Years later we would laugh at the event, and my grandmother would say, "Your Gramps liked to leave with a grand exit, and he certainly did that day. Let's not kid. That was a funeral people would never forget in a hurry. When your grandfather was discharged from his coffin, some people just gawked, others screamed, but your two little nieces continued to play with their dolls, as if no one else in the world existed in their make-believe world. They were oblivious to the catastrophic mayhem they had inadvertently caused. That poor priest! I've never seen a man so shaken up before in my life. He was dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief and looked visibly quite shaken. Maybe Gramps wanted everyone to see how good he looked, I had chided. I mean, he did look rather dapper that day, don't you remember? In his bright tie and red socks. You know what, Stephen? You make a good point, my grandmother had said. You might just be right there. I bet your Gramps is up in heaven. Well, he was on that day, killing himself laughing. He always saw the funny side in everything. Quite a character, your Gramps was. Growing up as a young boy, me and my older brother and mother lived with my parents in their white symmetrical farmhouse, with its grey slate roof and extensive outbuildings, all remarkably similar in appearance to the main house, which always looked attractive, set up against the viridescent splendour of the Colorado countryside, with its spectacular mountain views, cobalt blue sky, and rich alpine scenery that more often than not quite literally took your breath away. Me and my brother knew we were exceedingly privileged to live in such a tranquil, serene part of the world, where our eyes were treated to such a cocktail of beauty every single day. When I was 5 years old, my father was tragically killed on the back of his Harley-Davidson when a speeding truck threw him off the road like a toy car. It was discovered the truck driver had been well over the legal limit of alcohol. The driver ended up with a DUI and a 15-year prison sentence. We had moved in with our grandparents, and my Gramps had become a father to us. The farmhouse where we lived was the initial home that my grandfather had grown up in as a young boy. It had belonged to his father's father's father. Over the years, the farmhouse had been refurbished, and the interiors had been made to accommodate open-plan living at its finest, with rooms seamlessly folding into each other. Large entrances, high ceilings, open fireplaces, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked transfixing views of the Colorado countryside, where we lived close to the town of Ouray, located in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado, and our part of the world with its stunning alpine scenery is often known as the Switzerland of America. It was after my grandfather's unheralded death that my grandmother was scrambling around in the attic. She was coughing and spluttering, looking for some of my grandfather's things. She found old photographs of him, of when he was a young boy, which she was planning to put in an album, a memorial of his life, so to speak. "Look what I've got here," she says, handing me a dusty box of some of my grandfather's things from when he was a young boy. It contained drawings of my grandfather, ones that he did when he was very little. A vintage collection of toys that were still pristinely wrapped up in their boxes and looked as new as the day that they were first bought, and would probably fetch a tidy sum to a collector. There were dozens of comic books, old Christmas decorations, and among the possessions a leather-bound book that my grandfather had written as a young man, called the Book of Important Memories. One or two of the mentions in this book were recorded when he was 18 years old, which made us privy to a secret that he would have taken with him to the grave. It contained drawings that my grandfather had done when he was a little boy, a vintage collection of some toys that were still pristinely wrapped up in their boxes and looked as new as the day that they had been purchased, and would probably fetch a tidy sum with a collector. There were dozens of comic books, photographs, old Christmas decorations and toys, and among the possessions a leather-bound book that my grandfather had written as a young man, called the Book of Important Memories. One or two of the mentions in this book were recorded when he was only 18 years old, which made us privy to a secret that he could have taken to the grave with him. This is what he recorded in that book that really got my attention, and made me think of the strange face peering out at us at the tree after my grandfather had died, and then the gift we received the following day of the turkey and the berries. It did leave me wondering whether the hairy man, known as Bigfoot, had been clandestinely watching the comings and goings of our family over the years, and formed an unlikely attachment towards us, like we might to a movie star on a television, who will never get to know us, but we personally feel like we know them. Could it be like that for these enigmatic, evasive and elusive creatures of the woods? It seemed more than a little likely, in my opinion. I do remember once saying to my grandfather, "Do you think Bigfoot exists?" And he looked at me through his astute blue eyes and turned the question on me, which was an avoidance strategy of his. "Well, what do you think?"
Do you think Bigfoot is real?"
I shrugged my shoulders and said, "Believing is seeing."
And my grandfather said, "There you are then. You've answered your own question. Believing is seeing. When you see him, you'll believe in him."
My grandfather's written account. I do not know what happened that fateful day, but I got about as close to death as you could ever get. I suppose I'd always believed I was invincible, but I'm beginning to realise that that is not the case. I'm recording this event so that it never ever fades from my mind, as there are some things I don't want to forget, and this is certainly one of them. The memories I have of my early childhood are so hazy, which is why I have taken the initiative to write down this story. Who's to say that my memory will not be very vague in 10 years' time, which might mean I forget all about this. And I want to remember every part of it, every last detail, so I can relive this experience again and again. It was, put simply, the worst and best experience of my life, which seems contradictory, I know, but it unequivocally was, and I'm still trying to assimilate it all. I have no intention of sharing this account with anyone at all, lest people should think that I'm completely balmy and have lost leave of my senses, but also because I'm extremely private. I'm sure people would think that I was disorientated, in a foggy state, after the fortuitous accident, that I must have imagined the whole thing, but I didn't. Looking back at the incident, I ask myself, did that really happen? But I know that it did. It was on a Saturday morning that my alarm clock went off. I immediately jumped out of bed like a jumping jack. I was so excited. I always thoroughly enjoyed hunting wild turkey with my father, and today was no exception to that rule. It was quite a chilly morning, but I knew before long the sun would be out. I padded over to my parents' bedroom, tapping my father gently on the shoulders. He jumped up with a start, his face edged with panic, until he realised it was me. Then he calmed down, and his face visibly began to relax.
"What's up, son?" he said to me, peering at me through half-shut eyes.
"Dad, you've forgotten. We're going hunting, turkey hunting this morning. Remember, you promised." My father groaned, glancing at his bedside clock, which registered 5 in the morning.
"Sorry, son. I'm just not up to it at this ungodly hour in the morning. I've been physically exhausted from working the fields. Can't the turkeys wait?" "I tell you what, how about we do an afternoon hunt, a late afternoon hunt?"
Of course, I knew the late afternoon hunt would never materialise, as by then my father was never up to hunting. He was way too exhausted from working the fields and all that manual hard labour. "Dad, please, I beg. Once you're up and you've wiped the cobwebs from your eyes, you'll be so glad you came along."
"Sorry, son," says my father, rolling over on his side and going back to sleep, as if I was all but a mere brief intrusion in his dream, or a mosquito that he had to swat. Moments later I'm greeted to my father's snores, as he simply faded into the oblivion of his dreams. My mother looks up at me from her bed covers with bleary eyes congealed with sleep. "Sweetheart, go back to bed, will you? This is no time to be up. It's so chilly out there." I was feeling extremely annoyed, very aggrieved. How many times had my father promised to come turkey hunting with me? But our plans kept going awry. Last night over dinner he had faithfully promised me he'd not let me down this time, but he'd done it yet again. Why was I even remotely surprised? I should have guessed this would happen. I knew my dad would not be enamoured with me going hunting turkey all on my own. He had sagaciously warned me against it. Tough titty, I thought. "Son, you're not ready to hunt on your own. You're still quite cack-handed with the rifle, and your bullets always miss the target. Your hunting skills need a lot of refining and polishing, but with plenty of practice, we'll make a fine hunter out of you yet." It was all well and good making erroneous promises that would never come to fruition. I wanted to expediently improve on my hunting skills. I needed practice, and lots of it. You heard of people being self-taught, didn't you? When it came to painting, cooking, even sports. Why should it be any different with hunting? The more I practiced, the better I'd invariably become. And if my father didn't teach me, then I'd teach myself. If my father was refusing to take me hunting, then I'd go on my own. And just imagine if I returned home with a massive tom. I'd love to see the expression on my father's face. He'd be so impressed, and he'd have to rethink the notion that I'm so cack-handed with a rifle. I'd enjoy seeing him eat his words. I didn't like being called cack-handed. I admit that there is room for improvement with my hunting skills, but who's to say I can't get a hole-in-one with my first shot? Anyone who knows anything about turkey hunting knows it takes a great deal of skill to take down one of those highly alert birds that don't suffer fools gladly. My mind is eagerly hemorrhaging arresting, satisfying visions of the big feathery trophy that I will bring back to my father, and even better, pictures of his nonplussed expression as I throw the big bird in front of him at the breakfast table. I am galvanized to get going. I quickly prepare myself some hot coffee in a flask, along with some ham sandwiches on brown bread that I can eat under the cover of darkness before the sun begins to rise. Finally armed with my rifle, torch, and a small rucksack thrown over my back that contains my essentials, I leave a note on the sideboard next to the kitchen sink saying, "Gone hunting," which would likely give my father reason to panic. I smile at the rather satisfying thought. Serves him right. I didn't give a toss. That's what you get for fobbing your son off every chance you get. It was payback for being so quick to abandon his promises that he'd made to me over and over again tirelessly. It is still dark outside, with a gentle moonlight filtering through the sky, casting soft shadows across the grass that is dappled with a silvery dew. There is a cool breeze blowing, and a biting chill in the air. It's early spring. The weather is still hanging on to the residues of the less than agreeable, capricious, blistering winter months we have recently endured, which was a turn-up for the books, I have to say. The coldest winter we've had in a long time. Normally our winters in Colorado are mild, with snow not staying on the ground for very long, but this was one of those winters that welcomed many cold days that numbed our fingers and toes exceptionally. Maybe this is another reason why I want to break free from this insufferable claustrophobic hibernation, like a ravenous bear emerging from its nest after a long cold sabbatical, searching for food. I was hungry for a venturesome adventure myself, even if it was one of my own making and creation. I walk cautiously over the undulating grass of my parents' lawn that does not know the meaning of the word flat. Finally I reach the rather rugged contours that haphazardly outline and fringe the woodgrove that at this time of the morning transforms the tall, vertical, imposing silhouettes of the trees into voluptuous but menacing cardboard cutouts. I've been into the woods with my father at this time of the morning on a plethora of occasions, but I will concede that the woods seemed far more oppressively daunting, almost bodeful, when everything is veiled in a dark, tenebrous blanket that cloaks the vegetation in a blurry haze, so you can't see your way clearly in this forsaken black wilderness where everything retracts into the shadows and is swallowed up by the darkness. I'm ever grateful for my torch. It highlights my way magnanimously, ironing away some of the cloak and dagger reticence that the forest engenders. It helps that I know exactly where I'm going. I know where the turkeys nest at night. I'm well acquainted and familiar with their roosting arrangements and all their comings and goings. I may lack an agile dexterity when it comes to using a rifle, but I know the habits of the indigenous wildlife here, as well as I know the back of my own hand and the look of my own face in the bathroom mirror. I'm careful not to make a noise, so moving briskly through the trees is out of the question for me, as the rugged, rather steep pathway is bespeckled with leaf litter and branches, and some of the crunching noises beneath the soles of my boots could easily alert some of those roosting turkeys to my clandestine presence. Before long, I find my way to a neat, comfortable clearing under a large oak tree, and I slouch very happily against its trunk, sighing inwardly with relief. I've made it. I've actually made it. I feel reasonably chuffed with myself, secretly satisfied that my stealthful approach to my hiding spot was rather successful, and that I managed to keep my presence very discreet. I retrieve my flask from my knapsack and pour myself a cup of hot coffee, which trickles down my throat with a warming appreciation. I feel so much better. The caffeine kicks into my system and I feel much more alert. The great news is that the more that I'm cocooned in this dense woodland sanctuary of trees, the more acclimatized I become to the twilight that appears to have lost its menacing hold over me. I physically begin to relax, breathing in and out comfortably. I sense a steaming exhilaration rising up in my belly, along with anticipatory effervescent bubbles of excitement as I envisage the turkey I'm going to take down and the shocked look of admiration on my father's face. I can't wait to see it, and it keeps replaying over and over again in my head. I really want to succeed this morning in my mission. I impatiently wait for the dawn to be birthed, but before the sunlight even dares to make her presence known, the forest is suddenly filled with an unrepressed birdsong that lifts the forest up out of its sleepy slumber. Soon the darkness drifts away, like the white smoke from a chimney, and then, in the subdued, faint but ethereal light, I see a couple of raccoons studying me curiously from a tree branch, as if they're rather perturbed by my presence. They look like two armed bandits, with black patches on their eyes. Call me a soft touch, but I've always been rather fond of raccoons. I throw out a bit of my ham sandwich on the ground. At first the raccoons seem hesitant, as they study the tempting treat, and then one of the raccoons allows his fear to subside. It's overcome by his greed. He darts down eagerly towards the sandwich and begins to eat it in his tiny hands, all the while watching me through his dark eyes. "Is that good?" I say to him quietly. "Is that good?" The other raccoon on the tree is still overcome by a strangling reticence, but realizing he's missing out, finally his reservations are defeated, and he hurriedly darts down the tree, grabbing a piece of bread and scurrying away. I amuse myself feeding these raccoons that appear to be gaining trust in me, but finally they disappear, as the first shafts of sunlight burst through the trees with a rude intrusiveness. It's not long before I can hear the turkeys making a commotion as they rise out of their sleeping slumber. I'm so excited because I've just seen the hugest tom, and that's the one I want to take back to my dad this morning. I just can't wait. I can't wait to see his face. I can't wait. I stealthily move through the trees and fire a shot at the turkey. But the next thing I know, my shot ricochets, and I feel this burning sensation in my legs. And I fall to the ground, clutching my leg hard, wincing in pain, groaning in agony. The turkeys have long since darted away, with much squawking and excitable flapping sounds. I glance down at my leg. I know that I'm in a precarious predicament. I can't walk out of this forest. The burning pain is searing through me. It's excruciating. It's so agonizing. And there's so much blood. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere. All of a sudden I find myself looking up into a very concerned face. Before I can even react, this huge hairy human man has just yanked my shirt off me, and all the buttons pop off and go flying into the air. He tears my shirt up into strips, while I watch him bemused. Am I dreaming this? I've got to be dreaming this. He tears the fabric as if it's nothing, and let me tell you, this cloth is brand new. What is this thing that is trying to help me? What on earth is he? He's so human, but he's covered in long flowing dark hair, the colour of coal. He's got a cone-shaped head, and arms so long he could probably touch his toes without even bending his knees. And the size of this thing, there are no words. He's enormous, easily 8 foot tall, over 750 pounds in weight. The creature is wrapping my leg up very tightly in the piece of cloth to make a tourniquet, and he looks up into my terrified eyes. I'm not frightened of this hairy man, but I am frightened of dying, because there is so much blood, and I'm beginning to feel faint, light-headed. My eyes are going blurry. The creature gives me an encouraging nudge, as if he's trying to reassure me. I wish he wasn't being so kind. He makes me feel all the more sorry for myself. This hairy man picks me up in his arms. He's running with me through the forest across the grassy meadow towards the farmhouse. I feel as if I'm floating. There are moments I seem to be drifting out of my body, as everything becomes so faint, as if I'm slipping away. The creature is pounding at the front door of the farmhouse with his fists, and then I remember nothing more after that. I think I must have blacked out. I wake up to find myself in my bedroom, the doctor smiling down at me. I know him well. He always pops around to our house. "You're a very lucky man. Your gunshot missed the main artery by a hair's breadth. But it was touch and go for a moment. But that tourniquet you did, it pretty much saved your life. Well done for knowing what to do in an emergency. You'll be pleased to know we got the bullet out. And you didn't even flinch. You were out for the count. We've stitched you up very nicely. What happened? How did you get shot?" My father's standing in the doorway watching me, with an aggrieved expression on his face. He's wiping his brow with his hand, but he's saying nothing. I think he's quite rattled, while my mother is seated at the end of the bed, holding my hand reassuringly. I can see she's been crying, so she's obviously very upset over this incident. I sensed she was scared she was going to lose me. I stumble. I think my bullet ricocheted. I'm not sure why. I thought I did everything right." "Son," pipes my father, "I told you you're not ready to hunt unsupervised. You're very heavy-handed with the rifle."
"Don't you go blaming our son for this," says my mother, getting really heated. "What did you expect, Murray? Our son was so disappointed. You are entirely responsible. You promised to take our son turkey hunting over and over again, but you failed him every time, so he decided to go out on his own. What did you expect would happen? We could have lost our son this morning because you were too damn lazy to get out of bed. You knew how he was looking forward to that hunt. But no, your sleep was far too important for you."
My father frowns. "Your mother's right, son. I failed you big time. I must apologise for that. None of this mess would have ever occurred if I'd kept my promise to you. No wonder you went out and hunted on your own, and you know that was a very silly thing for you to do. But I promise you, when you're better, we'll go hunting together, and I won't rest until I've made a fine hunter out of you yet."
It's been 2 weeks since the incident, and I'm recovering nicely, but I've seen no sign of the mysterious hairy man that saved my life. But I've told no one of my experience. My parents believe I made the tourniquet. They opened the door to find me on the doorstep, but the creature had been long gone. I do hope I see him again, but I'm not sure I ever will. I was stunned by my grandfather's Bigfoot encounter, that he never ever shared with any of our family members. But I do know that my Gramps was a brilliant hunter. He did tell me once that he'd shot himself in the leg when a bullet ricocheted, but not once did he let me in on the whole story. Perhaps he didn't want to share the secret with anyone. I'm now of the firm opinion that there is a Bigfoot in our woodgrove that watches out for us and will only show up when we're in a big spot of bother, like my Gramps was on that inauspicious day. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.